In the past, there was a time when Russia played the role of a bridge between Eastern and Western countries. However, centuries under the rule of Emperor Nicholas II eventually put Russia on the path to becoming part of Europe rather than Asia. For many years, the Kremlin has believed that a strong-willed leader would be more suitable for the land of the birch than a professional politician. It can be understood that Russians want to form a distinct identity, but this very factor is an obstacle for Moscow on the path to becoming a modern Western country. When the former Soviet republics gained independence in 1991, the Baltic states immediately rejoined the Western world. Russia also changed to become a true democratic country. However, political barriers caused many difficulties and expanded opportunities for President Putin to seize power. Since the conflict with Ukraine, the Kremlin has been trying to strengthen its relations with Eastern countries. However, if Russia wants to form an alliance in the Asian region, there will be many questions that need to be answered. According to IntelliNews, after the outbreak of war in Eastern Europe, it was not the emerging countries that supported President Putin, but these countries were concerned about the reaction of the West when the US weaponized dollar and sanctions Russia. The consequence was the weakening of the foundations of international trade activity and causing significant fluctuations in the global economy. Now they are being forced to choose sides. Many have decided that President Vladimir Putin's main complaint that we live in a unipolar world where America calls the shots is right, and they would prefer to have a multipolar world where every country makes its own choices and resolves problems collectively. That is what is driving the EMs into the BRICS bloc, led by China and Russia, the only emerging markets with a seat in the UN Permanent Security Council, military and nuclear capabilities on a par with the rest and economically large enough to have real heft in geopolitics. And Russia and China have four things that draw the other EMs in. The first is the multipolar view includes an implicit promise not to push values on partners. There is no global policeman in the multipolar worldview. The second is the EMs are coming of age but feel themselves underrepresented in the current geopolitical setup. The UN Permanent Security Council only has 5 members, but 3 of those are European, plus the US, born of Europe, as well as China. There are no representatives at all from Latin America or Africa, and even India, the most populous country on the planet, is not included. Third, almost all of the rest of the world have suffered from the colonialism of the First World in the past, an abuse that still rankles today. India, Africa, and large parts of South America were all captured by one colonial power or other. China was never conquered, but it was flooded with opium by the British and lost 2 wars trying to ban the trade, leading to the century of humiliation. The empires may be forgotten in the West, but the scars are still raw today amongst the victims. Finally, the smaller members of the EM bloc are simply not wealthy enough to afford to take principled stands. They are just trying to earn enough money to build their countries and keep their people happy. Sanctions that cut them off from the vital raw materials or drive up costs are simply not an option. Unable to face down the G7 on their own, they are looking to the BRICS bloc for support in a common cause that can square up to the West. It was never in the US interest to drive Russia and China closer together. Putin has always made it clear he would prefer to be part of Europe, as he shares the same fears about China's rise. In an article during the visit of Chinese President Xi Jinping to Moscow in March, Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke about considering China as a friend and described the relationship between Moscow and Beijing with an optimistic perspective. Russia is likely to start buying foreign currency as soon as this month, marking the first time Moscow has replenished the country's reserves since it invaded Ukraine more than 1 year ago. Moscow is likely to snap up around 200 million US dollars in Chinese yuan each month, Bloomberg Economics reported. The yuan is one of the few key currencies available to Russia after Western sanctions cut the country off from the world's dollar-denominated financial system. After its invasion of Ukraine, Russia was hit with sweeping Western sanctions and it suspended its currency intervention program. By June, a US-backed global task force had blocked over 300 billion US dollars worth of assets held by Russia's central bank. Russia resumed its currency intervention program again in January 2023, starting with the yuan. The volumes of FX purchases will be small initially, but highly symbolic as they will show that the country, instead of eating through reserves, is building them, said Alexander Isatkov, a Russia economist at Bloomberg Economics. Moscow's resumption of foreign currency reserve interventions would indicate that Western sanctions and a G7-led price cap on Russian crude aren't enough to curb Russia's energy revenues. On the Chinese president's visit, Putin went as far as to mention the negative influence of the so-called collective West on the current world order and the crisis in Ukraine. This is significant as Putin, by hinting at the creation of a united front against the West, was effectively showcasing what it is the Kremlin has to offer China, as well as to other Asian countries, as an inducement to accept Russia as part of their continent politically. However, although the joint statement of the two leaders described the Russia-China relationship as being at its highest level in history, President Xi Jinping remained cautious, avoiding mentioning specific issues related to the world order and the conflict in Ukraine. The West has traditionally seen India as a friend, but when it comes to actions rather than words, India pays more attention to what Putin wants than it does to the desires of Washington or London. India's close ties to Russia might seem more obvious since the war in Ukraine started in February last year, but good relations between the two countries go back a long way. A positive relationship between the two countries has existed since the 18th century. Following independence from Britain, India once again established firm diplomatic ties, beginning with Nehru's 1955 visit to the Soviet Union. Since the 1960s, the Soviet Union has supplied the Indian military with advanced weaponry that it would have had difficulty obtaining elsewhere, and India has in fact often looked to the Soviets and then Russia as a potential ally against the West. Perhaps the strongest example of Soviet Union military support came during the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, when the Kremlin deployed nuclear submarines to the Indian Ocean to ward off any Western meddling with Indian interests. That long-standing supply of weapons to India continues. Russian state news agency in February said arms exports to India at around $13 billion over the past 5 years. Tellingly, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has never condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, relations between India and Russia are only set to strengthen, with the two countries in advanced negotiations on establishing a free trade agreement. A lot of Westerners think of India as a benign, neutral democracy, which should naturally align with the liberal values against the bloody-handed tyranny of modern Russia. But the Indians don't see it that way, and the blunt truth is they are keeping Vladimir Putin in business for no better reason than slightly cheaper oil. Karan Merishi, Indian economics commentator, tells The Telegraph that Russian imports have saved India around $3 billion in the past year, compared to its total annual oil import bill of nearly $120 billion. Russia has even knocked the OPEC off the top spot for supplying India. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi seems to believe that India is simply seizing the opportunity to snap up cheap crude to meet its rising demand. The Indian economy is the fastest growing on earth and is expected to become the world's third largest by 2025. It will attain the $10 trillion GDP threshold by 2031, says Marishi. Inflation worries rather than geopolitical concerns have taken center stage, leading New Delhi to brush away Western reprobation without increasing economic ties with Moscow, comments Susanna Streeter, head of money and markets at Hargreaves Lansdowne. The approach appears to be working, with India's headline inflation rate going in the right direction, helped also by lower food prices, Streeter said. Refinitiv Oil Research Analysis forecasts that India will import 1.94 million barrels per day from Russia, more than doubling since last July and exceeding total imports from the Middle East region. As a result, Russia has been able to escape the worst effect of the penalties imposed by the West to isolate it. Russia's speech may have fallen on deaf ears, though as Asian countries who view the West negatively have no need of help from Russia, whose global influence is diminishing by the day. Xi Jinping in particular continues to show strength in his own confrontation with the West, especially with the US, without needing Moscow's assistance. As for India, the main concern of the country seems to be primarily related to the benefits of importing oil from Russia. In addition, India does not want an overly close relationship between Moscow and Beijing, a risk factor for the New Delhi government. Over the past few decades, China and India have had numerous disagreements. As a result, if Russia tightens its relationship with one country, it is difficult to ally with the other. Therefore, although China and India are Russia's two largest economic partners, the formation of a Russian-led alliance in the Asian region seems unlikely to occur. Nowadays, Moscow's economic dependence on the Asian region will be a temporary solution to cope with the Western sanctions. Based on this, Russian leaders can strengthen their relationships with Asian countries. However, Asian countries may need to be cautious as there have been warnings about new U.S. tariff regulations. MarketWatch reported on May 1st that the EU and the US have implemented many sanctions targeting Russia, but some countries have not participated in the embargo and have even benefited from these sanctions. The most typical example in this case is India, as the country purchases oil from Russia, and this action is helping Moscow maintain its military strength. In addition, Indian factories are using cheap oil from Russia to compete with American companies. Since 1990, the New Delhi government began to accept more foreign direct investment to improve production capacity. For foreign companies, the only way to sell products in India is to manufacture in the country. As a result, multinational corporations have built facilities in various locations and transferred technology to India. Now, Indian companies simply need to import cheap Russian oil and then export a range of products based on this raw material. The United States is one of India's largest customers. In 2022 alone, India's merchandise trade surplus with the U.S. reached a record $33.8 billion. Notably, the United States imports many chemical products originating from Indian crude oil. With the advantage of cost, the product line from India is causing significant damage to U.S. companies, as American manufacturers have to compete with chemical, plastic, and polyester products exported from India worth billions of dollars each year. Data from 2022 shows that the value of imports has increased to an enormous amount. In addition to $9 billion in organic chemicals, mineral fuels, and oils, the United States imported rubber and plastics worth $2.8 billion from India last year. Additionally, there were about $1 billion in imports of industrial plastics, derivatives, and fertilizers. These are all items that the U.S. could produce domestically. The ripple effect also causes losses for the U.S. construction industry, as industrial plastics are the main input materials in quartz, countertops, floor tiles, and other construction products. Indian quartz countertop manufacturers who have faced import taxes due to violation of U.S. trade laws are now using Russian oil to continue competing with U.S. manufacturers. At this point, the United States needs to respond to exploitative behavior with specific solutions, such as banning imports of products made from Russian crude oil. Previously, there was a precedent for this when in February, the United States imposed a stiff tariff on Russian aluminum. To make the aluminum tariff fully effective, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency required detailed composition information for any aluminum product to be sold in the U.S. market. That meant any imported products containing Russian aluminum would be taxed. According to Market Watch, the United States cannot ask India to participate in the sanctions, but Washington should take a stance against goods produced in defiance of the sanctions. Congress should consider higher tariffs or implement bans on goods produced with Russian crude oil, because if exploitative behaviors continue, American consumers are indirectly sponsoring Moscow when they purchase Indian products. Currently, Russia cannot trade with the West, so the pivot to the East strategy is the most feasible option. However, important partners in the Asian region, such as China and India, each have their own calculations. Therefore, it is not easy for Russia to form an alliance in the region. This means that Moscow will have to continue to lower products prices and seek additional partners to strengthen its power for a long-term battle.